I'm Dr. Alan Murray and I'm the Senior Lecturer in Enterprise here at University of West of Scotland. Just like to welcome you all to the latest in our series of entrepreneurial talks, and the purpose of these events is really just to get people in from all sides of the enterprise and entrepreneurship table, listen to their stories and maybe get a little bit insight into the challenges they faced and what the solutions they came up with were to those problems. So in terms of how it's going to run today, there is a fire alarm that's due to happen, and I think it's overdue. So if that happens and it stops, it's not the real thing. If it continues, or there's another one, it is the real thing. And assuming you can keep up with me, you can follow me out that door. We'll go right, and then we'll gather outside in the assembly area, okay? Again, if you need the toilet, don't stick your hand up. Just go out those doors, go through the next set of doors, go through the next set of doors, and they're on your left. So we're delighted today to welcome Mark Logan. You might recognise Mark's face as he's one of the founders of Skyscanner, but he's also the Chief Entrepreneur for Scotland. And in that role, he's authored a really important report which broadly sets the direction of travel for entrepreneurship in Scotland for the next few years. And he's going to talk about that. And clearly there's a role in that for universities and others to play. So Mark will probably speak for about 40 minutes or longer if he needs to. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Johnny, who's Head of Business Innovation here at UWS, and he'll chair the panel part of the event. So I would invite you to come up with some questions, because we don't often get an opportunity for this type of thing. What I'll be doing just before that, though, is I'll be handing over to a couple of my senior colleagues here at the university who will talk briefly about what we're doing here and why we're doing it. To finish, I'll invite everybody here up at the end of the event once I've made my closing remarks, and you'll have some light refreshments. Now, we're conscious of the fact that, unsurprisingly, the online tickets for the networking element sold out really quickly, so we've put a little bit more catering on, and we've extended the space a little bit. So anyone here who wants to go upstairs can go upstairs, just don't eat all the chocolate biscuits before I get there. Okay? So before we start, I'm just going to hand over to Professor James Miller, who is the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University, who's going to say a few words.
Great. Thanks very much. And first of all, can I welcome everybody to the University of the West of Scotland. It's great to see so many people here, and obviously extend a particular welcome to Mark. We're all really looking forward to his session this afternoon. There's just a few comments that I wanted to make, particularly in relation to entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs. And the first thing that I think is really important to get across is that we need to think about entrepreneurship as not, or being an entrepreneur is not about having a job as an entrepreneur. It's a mindset, and therefore we've got to think about moving it in a slightly different direction. And that's what this series is really all about. And therefore, from a university's perspective, it applies to all disciplines in all schools. We've got to think about how we can apply those skills to everybody. We do, of course, have a fantastic role model in the university in our Chancellor. Yukemi Otaru is a serial entrepreneur, and she comes from a very different background and comes at entrepreneurship in a particular way. So as a university, we have a great role model, which is really important because the demography of our students means that they come from a wide background, a wide range of backgrounds, and that means that sometimes they would not necessarily have an entrepreneur as a role model in their sphere. So it's a really important part of the university. There's a huge amount happening in the university as well around entrepreneurships and supporting those who do want to set up their own business. We've got both online and on-campus support for students. We help facilitate both internal and external competitions. We've got programme activities, we've got an incubation space, startup support, and the student enterprise area. It's also true, of course, that we try and build it into our curriculum through our Aspire modules, which were recently introduced, and as they get rolled out over the piece, then more and more students will get involved in it. We were just talking upstairs, actually, that we do tend to think about entrepreneurship as business creation and the setting up of business, which of course is a really important part of it. But I wouldn't want us to lose the notion of social entrepreneurship and what that means in terms of finding innovative and creative solutions to community-based problems. And finding those innovative ideas to really make a difference in a whole variety of spheres, the NHS, teaching, social work, social care, a whole raft of areas that we've got to think about in a slightly different way. And one challenge I think that we might want to think about, always interrupted by a fire alarm, one thing that I do think we might need to think about is, do we think about entrepreneurial skills as a meta skill? And what do we mean by a meta skill? And if we start to shift that thinking a little more, then it becomes imbued in absolutely everything we do. So looking forward to a really fascinating presentation from Mark and a discussion thereafter. Once again, very welcome to UWS.
Thanks for that. So now I just want to hand over to Milan, who's Vice-Chancellor and Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research, Innovation and Enterprise. It is a bit of a mouthful, Milan. Milan is a huge champion of enterprise in the university, not just at a school level, and he's one of the reasons why we've been able to do as much as we've been able to do in the last 18 months or so.
Thank you, James, our real Vice-Chancellor, for the introduction. Look, I'll be a little bit provocative here with the printed papers and not being digital, because I've got a few images and a few charts to show before I hand over. Look, I'm reiterating what James has said earlier. It's about mindset. It's all about mindset. And the mindset, entrepreneurial mindset, is at the heart of innovation, is at the heart of startups, is at the heart of any kind of change in any organization. Without entrepreneurial mindset, you won't want to change. And wanting to change is one of those things that we want to do here. But speaking of the startup environment, to kind of go into the whole realm of creating a startup ecosystem within the country, I've got a few images to show and some words as well. I mean, you won't see that, and quite rightly so, because it's a maze of logos on a map. But I'll have a question. Does anyone venture to guess where this is, by the way?
Silicon Valley.
That's a Silicon Valley indeed, and on this paper, because I don't want to kind of make the commercial for them, these are the logos of all the companies that exist within the Silicon Valley. And the second one, and I'll tell you what I mean by this, the second one is the chart that shows basically where the concentration on venture capital firms is. And I'll read it for you because, Michelle, you won't be able to see this, but 28% of the investor count is the Silicon Valley, so San Francisco Bay Area. In the US. That's the whole of the US, so 28%, right? That's that chart. And the second chart, therefore, is the number of deals that are being made across the whole of the US, and surprise, surprise, 24% are within the wider San Francisco Bay Area. Now, why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this to demonstrate one really important point that we've been making at this institution for a while now, that entrepreneurial ecosystem is a complex ecosystem of the programs, people, support mechanisms that are intertwined, sometimes competing, but are creating this vibrancy and are creating these opportunities to everyone, whether they are nurses or whether they are business students or whether they are business people, or whether they are basically A-level students, as we call them, or mature students. It doesn't matter. That's what the supportive entrepreneurial ecosystem needs to look like. And one of the reasons why, when Johnny has established the Student Innovation Hub, at UWS, we were kind of having a goal of having numerous support mechanisms, and we knew that this is going to take years of very hard work, is precisely to achieve what James has said earlier. And that is entrepreneurial mindset support and the support mechanisms that can address all types of innovations, all types of change, all types of improvements, whether you're talking about an innovation within NHS, whether you're talking about innovators or edupreneurs within the education establishment, or whether you talk about the startups, all of this needs to be supported. And of course, that's not easy. It's tough. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of basically competing sometimes programs, and not a single support program, which is normally, and I'll be provocative again here, which is normally how the higher education institutions approach enterprise. To basically say, right, okay, we're ticking the box, we have a support program, we move on. It doesn't work that way, and it has been demonstrated. And then I have my final, kind of, before I hand over, a final figure. Can anyone tell me what this reads, if you can read it? It has 100 on top, and then it says 800 since 1967. Do you know which university, or which, oh, I just told you. Right, which university that relates to? I told you it's a university, but you don't know which one. Can anyone tell me which university you think that is? John is correct, that's Edinburgh. So Edinburgh has created 100 spin-out or startup businesses since 1967, when they have developed the first one, and now I forgot its name, and Johnny knows why, because it's my memory, but it's the first one in 1967, which was a medical device company established then. And that's Edinburgh. But let me tell you, this figure is in my head for UWS one day, okay? Because when we can achieve this in UWS and others follow suit, then we will be, in my mind, in a very crude way, achieve the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Scotland that is worthy talking about worldwide. And now I hand over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Milan and James. Both very inspiring comments. As you can see, I'm using some amplification because my voice isn't as loud as some people who are here today. And I hope you can hear me okay. So let me ask you a quick question. Is anybody paying attention to Elon Musk and Twitter right now? Are you following those stories? Now, aside from all the headlines about, you know, is he treating people well, badly? Has he gone mad? Is he being a super genius? How could we understand if his strategy is correct? Now, that's an important question, because when you go into business, regardless of whether or not you're an entrepreneur or anything like that, if you're just in a big company or wherever you might go, being able to analyse and understand the things you see happening around you strategically in that business is extremely important. So what I'm going to talk about today is, as was very, very eloquently stated earlier, entrepreneurship is firstly about a mindset. But what happens if you've got that mindset? What then? Because I've met a lot of people with a mindset who fail all the time as entrepreneurs, because it's also about technique. And you sometimes maybe think, well, am I an entrepreneur? Could I start a business? Could I grow it? But you can learn technique. It's a skill you can learn. It's a knowledge set. And I want to share some technique with you today from, we mentioned the Silicon Valley just a few moments ago, from Silicon Valley style playbooks. And I can't be exhaustive about this, and entrepreneurship is a vast subject, and James talked about social entrepreneurship is just an example of that. So I'm not trying to be exhaustive, I'm just trying to open a door for you into a world where you can learn technique and you can make those assessments. Is my startup going to work? What would I have to do to make it work? Or I'm in a business, how do I assess its strategy, etc. And we're going to use real companies that we've all heard of as part of this, and we'll return to that Twitter question as well and see if we can, having learned some technique, shed a bit of light into, you know, what's actually going on there, you know, once the headlines and the noise and the drama is taken away. But let's start with a question. How can startups win against huge companies? So for example, routinely you see small startups, you know, the fabled two people in a garage or in a bedroom or whatever, winning against companies with 100,000 employees. How can that possibly happen? Well, there's a few sort of reasons for that. And this is a summary of some of them. Firstly, they can move very quickly. So let's say we start a business, the two of us here today, we can very quickly develop our ideas, make decisions. In big companies, if I want to make a decision about should we buy a different brand of photocopy paper from some other company, that could take months. So that's how you can compete in one sense. They also have no legacy, because when the world changes, if you've spent billions of pounds building a product, you're very, very wedded to that. And a startup doesn't have that legacy. So to give you an example, I remember back before the mobile phone was a thing, Microsoft was like hugely dominant in tech, hugely dominant, much more than you can really comprehend now from this distance, and bigger relative to the rest of the market than Google or Apple. It controlled every PC basically in existence. Now, that meant that because Windows was so successful, the whole culture of the business became about Windows. So when the mobile phone came along, because that legacy had made them successful, they couldn't help thinking about the mobile phone as a smaller Windows PC with a start button and all that kind of stuff. And they lost, the mobile revolution almost killed Microsoft. A startup doesn't have that legacy, so that's another way you can move faster. And you can actually embrace the world as it is now. So for example, every time there's a major economic downturn, and we've gone through like the horrors of COVID, but back in 2008 we had a huge financial crash, you often see startups born in those most difficult times. Like Airbnb, for example, started around about 2008. Because they can just look dispassionately at the world now with its opportunities, whereas everybody else is clinging to their own business models and hoping that one day people will come back, for example, to the city centres and those kind of things. So that's how startups can win. But having said that, does anyone want to hazard a guess as to how many startups or what percentage of startups fail, given all these wonderful things going for them? Would you like to take a guess? 90? Anyone else? 99. That's a very optimistic group we are today. Well, you're both in absolutely the right ballpark. It depends what you read and so on, but it's on average it's about 80, and it's often higher. But the point is, it's most of them. Now we're all talking about entrepreneurship and starting companies, and isn't that great? It's not great sometimes, and I would venture that part of the reason why that number is so high is bad luck, right? Successful entrepreneurs are always a bit lucky. It's partly the product, just wasn't right for the market and so on, but it's often a lack of technique. And there's a fairly large number of startups that could have been successful, but they didn't have the technique, and they learned it too late. So some of the best people to hire into companies, and I've hired a lot of people into companies, are the people whose startup failed the last time around. But you don't want that to be you in your company, making those mistakes for the first time. So technique can be learned. We can study other people's mistakes. We can study other people's distilled best practice. I want to just share a few examples of that today. But these are some of the reasons why startups do fail. Product didn't fit its market. We've all heard of product market fit, perhaps. Does the market want this product? Or it did fit the market, but the team didn't know how to grow it within that market. That's quite common. Or it wasn't quite ready for the market, but we started basically expanding our customer base and trying to get more customers onto a product that wasn't quite ready, and we ran out of money because it didn't stay around. Or, this is quite a tragic one, the product was great, they knew how to grow the market, but the organisation kept blowing up because they didn't know how to organise and manage. And management, the underappreciated art of management is absolutely critical to startups being successful. So we're not going to talk about that today, but I'm sure you cover it in what you teach, and it's extremely important because human energy, unlike other forms of energy, can be created or destroyed, and the difference is how a team is organised and how it runs and all that kind of stuff. But we're going to focus on some of the other areas today. And this is the sort of trajectories that a company can follow. What you really want is that exponential picture. A lot of companies just get linear growth, which is still a good thing, right? If you hang around long enough, you're going to have a lot of customers. But most of them have this yellow line in different forms and different extremes. So let's look at some examples of the virtuous case. This is Facebook in its early days, and you can see it's got this exponential compounding growth. So it's growing proportionally to the number of current users. How does that happen? What causes the more users you have, the more users you get? What are the mechanisms to stimulate that? Let's come back to that question. Here's another example. This is Instagram, again, same shape, very nice. We talked about Twitter. Look at Twitter in its early days. You know, really had huge exponential growth in its early days. This is, I think, one I'm fond of. This is Skyscanner in its early growth. So it's not just Silicon Valley companies that can do this. This noise in the graph is seasonality. January is always a very busy month, December's not, so you get this spikiness, but that kept going for a long time. And it's not all just kind of consumer companies, so here you have Slack, for example, and it's also showing the same pattern. So exponential growth, compounding growth, where you grow proportionally to the number of users you have, is not just luck, it's actually technique, and we'll talk about that. Here's another example. This is TikTok and YouTube. Now, TikTok's in blue. If India hadn't shut TikTok out, you'd have the dotted pattern projected, and YouTube's in red. And what it's saying is, how long did it take these companies to grow at the same rate? Now, they're both success stories, of course. You know, we'd all like to have YouTube success. But look at how TikTok actually grew much faster, or so far much faster than YouTube, even though they're both growing exponentially. One's growing faster. Why is that? Well, we'll come back to that question as well in our presentation here. But going back to this set of possible outcomes, we all want one we just had, but we don't always get it. So let's look at some other examples. Does anyone remember MySpace? Showing your age if you do. MySpace was like before Facebook, there was MySpace. Here's Facebook, their sort of major competitor, and this is how they both performed over time. And you can see in this graph we're getting both of those patterns. We're getting the exponential case for Facebook, and we're getting that kind of yellow line. It was like all going well at MySpace, and then suddenly started to peter out. What happened there? Well, look at that. Or do you remember Clubhouse from just a couple of years ago? So when the COVID crisis arrived, there was lots and lots of noise about Clubhouse, because it was this thing you could drop into discussions, chats from intellectually agile people, and you can learn a lot of stuff. That was the idea. Elon Musk loved it. He was always on it. He was trying to get Vladimir Putin to debate with him on Clubhouse, and all that publicity was doing great things for Clubhouse. It was hugely hyped, and I think we're all old enough already to have seen a lot of hype in our lives, and we'll see a lot more. You've got to be able to stand back from hype and say, what's really going on underneath? Would I want to, join that business, or invest in that business, or take it seriously? This was what was happening with Clubhouse just over a year ago, and then this was what happened a few months later. There's all the headlines. Does anyone still use Clubhouse? Downloads have fallen off a cliff. What happened there? Well, this is what happened to their user traffic over time. This is Google Trends, which is a great tool for looking at how a company's doing. If people are typing in its name into Google, that's a good proxy for how it's doing. And if you compare that to TikTok, where you get the scale of the problem, but at one point everyone thought Clubhouse was the new TikTok. Now, if you stood back from this, you could have actually told, I knew and others knew that Clubhouse was going to fail because of some fundamental issues, because of technique. So we'll start to explore that technique now. Just finally, and kind of what things can look like. This graph here, this is from Farmville, is a more extreme example of the yellow line. And this is called jumping the shark. Do you know why it's called jumping the shark? Very technical reason, it looks like a shark's fin. But this is a very, very common picture of Silicon Valley. The hype for these companies is like super high, that everyone's saying it's the new Google, and then this happens. So this is what we need to get some insight into. Why do all these shapes happen? And why do all these investors who invested in Farmhouse or Clubhouse at the very peak of the hype, who've been investing for like 40 years and they're all very, very rich because of it, how can they be so wrong? So let's start to get into that. And we're going to do that by looking at something I call growth engineering, which is simply the techniques for systematically, not ad hoc, but systematically introducing products or ideas into the market and driving it to scale. And we're going to look just for a second at the Silicon Valley again. This is a similar diagram to the one that I'll just show this, except I'm doing it in a more sort of 3D, visually superior way. But the point here is that, as you made the point very well, that in a 200 square mile area, like most of the companies you've heard of exist, and really you do drive down Highway 101 and you see them all. Why is that? And you see San Francisco up there at the top, we're all crowded in. And it's basically because it's such a vast environment that there's lots of companies starting, lots of companies failing, but the ones that survive distill out best practice, and employees from those companies, they're pretty mercenary, they move around. That best practice leaks into other companies, and that is the Silicon Valley Playbook. So it's best practice in any epoch of technology. And you can follow these epochs, for example, going way back to the 50s. Why is the Silicon Valley called the Silicon Valley? Because it was a semiconductor focus at the time. Then it was a microprocessor, and it was internet and platforms. Then it was mobile, now you could add deep learning, you could add blockchain, etc. But in every generation, they start to tear down what they're already great at and start distilling technique for the next generation. And that's what a vibrant, mature ecosystem does. People renew their knowledge set. And one of those knowledge sets is growth engineering. It's called different things, but you'll see more and more in teams in the Valley and elsewhere that there's a growth team, there's a VP of growth and those kind of things. And it's about what we're going to look at here. So we're going to look at just 3 concepts. There's not time, obviously, to do this more exhaustively. I don't want to bore anybody. So we're going to just briefly look at how do you get compounding growth? What are network effects? So how do you get this kind of spontaneous compounding effect? And what are the foundations to make those things happen? And again, we're going to look at real companies to establish that. So let's start off with compounding growth mechanisms. We're going to call them CGMs for short, often called compounding growth loops as well. And this is a basic idea. You've got a product and you've got some users on the right-hand side, and some of those users tell their friends or business associates or whoever about the product, and some of those people become new users, and some of those new users tell their friends, and we start to go around this mechanism. That's a compounding growth loop. And there's 2 types. There's what we call direct and indirect. So a direct compounding growth loop is where someone explicitly invites someone else. So would you like to come and try WhatsApp so that I can talk to you? And an indirect one is where there's some intermediate currency that does that attraction. Like I write a blog and you read my blog and you quite like it, so you sign up for the product that you're reading it on. Then you write a blog and round we go. So 2 forms. Let's look at some real examples. We'll start with direct. So let's take WhatsApp. This is a really simple example. You could apply this to many other similar products. But WhatsApp, there's some people signed up for WhatsApp, and some of those people invite their friends because they want to talk to them, and some of those friends invite other friends, and round we go. And WhatsApp grew to several billion users by spending 0 on marketing. That's the power of a compounding growth loop. Let's take another example. Does everyone use LinkedIn here? You're on LinkedIn? Probably. If you're not, probably should be. Really boring product, but hugely successful. And it has lots of these mechanisms running. Here's just one. So in the early days, in fact, still now, people used to invite other people to LinkedIn, especially when it started, no one was on it, but people started receiving invites from other people. Exactly the same mechanism, compounding growth mechanism. Here's an example from Skyscanner. We didn't really know what we were doing at the start, so we didn't know we were doing this, but we had a compounding growth loop mechanism running as well. We didn't build it into the product. We didn't have a button saying invite your friends, but what we discovered was that some people using Skyscanner would tell their friends about it, who become users, who tell their friends, and round we go. So it's like what I call an organic compounding growth mechanism. We didn't build features to facilitate that invitation, but it still happened. I remember sitting in Starbucks and there was some students at another table and they were saying, you don't want to use that Expedia, you should try this Skyscanner thing. It's like a commercial, it was great. Now let's look at some indirect examples briefly. So in fact, I'll go back to just give you one, LinkedIn. So this time, what's happening here? Well, first of all, people have signed up for LinkedIn as per our previous example. And What happens, of course, what's the first thing you do when you sign up for LinkedIn? You create your CV or your profile. You know, here's all the interesting things about me, here's all the awards I've won, and here's all the things I'm interested in. That gets indexed by Google, and LinkedIn makes sure that it gets indexed really nicely by Google. And then people searching for you on Google come across your LinkedIn profile, and some of them visit LinkedIn, and some of them say, hey, this LinkedIn thing's quite good, I should be on this, and they sign up, and round it goes again. So this time, this is an indirect mechanism, because no one has actually invited anyone else in this case, but content is the currency to make this happen. So your profile is content, Google uses that content, and that attracts other users. And of course, LinkedIn are just masters at compounding growth mechanisms. They have lots of them running. For example, later on they introduced the ability to write a blog or a post, and then they would send these posts, index these posts, and people might search for, best practice in growing a team, and there's your blog on Google. And so, I come to read your article, and then I find this LinkedIn thing, and I sign up. So they've layered lots of these compounding mechanisms. And when I say things are not just luck, interestingly, a lot of these techniques were developed at PayPal originally, and there's such a thing as the PayPal mafia. I don't know if you've heard of it. And everyone who worked at PayPal, or not everybody, but quite a lot of people, they went off to other companies and applied the same techniques. And one of those was LinkedIn. And Elon Musk worked there as well. It's interesting to see how these things go. Elon Musk has spent zero on marketing the Tesla, more or less, until very recently. But he sure knows how to stir up word of mouth about it and make people love that car. Not everybody loves it, don't have to. Enough people love it to tell their friends, and off it goes again, an organic mechanism. So that's compounding mechanisms. And there's much more to this, of course, because there's a science behind this. In the case of direct compounding mechanisms, where people invite other people, you've got subcategories like, why do you invite other people? What's your motivation to do it? Sometimes it's because I've got some selfish benefit, like with WhatsApp, I can talk to James if I'm invited to WhatsApp, so I get a selfish benefit. Others, I don't get a selfish benefit, I get some financial reward. So if I'm using Dropbox and I invite someone else to Dropbox, we both get free storage. So that's a financial incentive loop. Or sometimes I just get social capital, like people think I'm cool because I've recommended something. Very rare in my case that people think I'm cool, but it might happen. But that's social capital. I'm doing it for no reason other than that I just get more social status. So a growth team understands these things and deliberately builds these mechanisms into the product. And that's why product design isn't about design a product or service and then figure out how to market it. It's how do I design into the very fabric of the product these growth mechanisms. That's how it's done now, when it's done well. Let's look at a very similar but also very different key concept, which is network effects. Have people heard of network effects in an informal sense? People are always banding that phrase around. What does it actually mean? Well, let's have a definition. Basically, it's a company's product or service becomes more valuable with more people on it. And for example, usually that means the more people using this product, the more value it is to all of the people using the product. And because of that attractive power, the product can almost grow by itself. So for example, if you're using Facebook and nobody you know is on it, then you're unlikely to join it really in that case. But if everybody you know is on it, you're much more likely to join it. It's much more valuable to you. So network effects are, in the modern age, extremely important when you're assessing a product idea or the value of an existing product. So, and they correspond very loosely to what's called Metcalfe's law. The value of that network to the individual people on it increases as a square of the number of people on it. That's why they're so powerful, because that's a real attractor. I want to be on that, I want to stay on it, because the value's going up and up and up. Now, that's not quite true in real life. There's variations on that theme. Like, for example, most networks are really networks of networks. So it doesn't benefit me if there's a new taxi driver in San Francisco if I live in Glasgow and Uber, for example. So it's not quite a linear thing. Also, the first 10 million users of a product are more valuable than when you've got 500 million and you add another 10 million. So it's a bit of an asymptotic value thing. But in principle, the value of the network increases according to this kind of relationship. So that's why they're important. Now, they're not the same as compounding growth mechanisms or viral effects, you can call others, because products can have no network effects but still use virality. You know, you can, the more, you can have mechanisms to attract and invite other people and reward them for doing that, but the more people on the product doesn't make a lot of difference to the value of it. So they're not the same thing, and let's test that. So, for example, Amazon. Does Amazon have network effects? Who would like to have a go at that? Should we take a guess? It's okay to be wrong, so. No idea is an honest answer. Anyone else want to take a guess? Doesn't have that? No, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have every possible answer you'd like to find out. So it does have network effects because Amazon is essentially a two-sided network. The more suppliers on Amazon, the more people are attracted to use it. And the more people are attracted to buy products on it, the more suppliers are attracted to be on it. So it's a special type of two-sided network, or of network called a two-sided network. So Amazon is one. What about Zoom? Well, we're all familiar with Zoom. Does Zoom have network effects? Yes. Well, funny enough, not really. It has very mild network effects. And think about that. If you want to have a video conference tomorrow, it doesn't really matter how many other people want to have video conferences. Not really, because I could just, if you invite me to a Teams call, I'll go on Teams. If you invite me to a Zoom call or one of these other products that are very similar, there's no real value for me in knowing that you've all previously invited people to Zoom calls, because if I invite you to a Teams call, you'll still come, assuming it's a worthwhile meeting. So Zoom has quite weak network effects, and that means if you put Amazon and Zoom together, then one is more likely, this is a bit simplistic because there's other factors involved, but one of them is more likely to grow faster than the other one. And actually that's what you do see with Zoom. Zoom grew really fast during the kind of exceptional circumstances of COVID, whereas Amazon has just grown all the way through for a very long time, because these network effects are super powerful. Now if I was in Zoom, what would I be trying to do? I'd be trying to establish as many compounding growth mechanisms as I can and see if I could instigate some network effects. And you can be sure that's what they're trying to do. Because they've got a product direction which goes well beyond video to try and create a network effect where the more of us on this product in a given business, the more powerful it is, because they know they've got weak network effects. It makes them vulnerable. So we've talked about one-sided networks. Let's look at some other examples. Here's the most famous one-sided network, the telephone network, the first physical electronic one-sided network. And way back in 1908, in the annual report for AT&T, which was one of the first telecoms companies, they knew this. It's that line at the bottom. A telephone without a connection at the other end is not even a toy or a scientific instrument. They understood network effects back then. That was their board report. Another good example is WhatsApp's more or less a one-sided network in the sense that there's only kind of one type of participant on it. This is a shopping mall. It's a two-sided network. You don't need to be software. The more people come into the shopping mall, the more shops want to be in the shopping mall. And the more shops, the more people want to come to the shopping mall. Here's the kind of abstract view of that. You've got buyers on one side, and you've got sellers on the other. You can also be buyers. But basically, the more of one you've got, the more of the other is attracted. And that's how it works. The more sellers, the more buyers, the more buyers, the more sellers. So let's look at some examples of that. So Skyscanner is a two-sided network with airlines and travel agents on one side and travelers on the other. So that meant that when I was asleep, and my colleagues were asleep, Skyscanner was still growing because of these network effects. Whereas I've been in other startups where we only made a sale when we went out and sold to customers and convinced them to sign, and then we had to implement the stuff we were doing for them. That's a much harder gig. If you can get network effects running, it's a really powerful place to be. And of course, all of these two-sided networks here, they often become multi-sided networks. For example, you might add advertisers. So the more users you have, the more advertisers want to be on your platform. We've seen that with Facebook, for example. Started off as a one-sided network, added advertisers. The advertisers come because it's a multi-sided, because there's lots of users and lots of reasons to be there, or content producers want to turn up. So most of the world's newspapers give their content to Facebook for free, so that because there's lots of users there and they might attract some of those users. So these are how these things work. Now, to look at a few kind of concepts around this, if you were trying to build a two-sided network, let's take eBay as an example, the first really important thing is you need network liquidity. So it means you need to have enough buyers and enough sellers, and you need to be in balance. So if you've got lots and lots of buyers and no sellers, these buyers are going to leave pretty quickly. Or lots of sellers but there's no buyers, then they're not going to hang around. So the trick of growing a two-sided network or a network business is how you create market liquidity, and the hardest time to do that is at the start. So I speak to a lot of startups and say, I've got this great idea, and it's basically a two-sided network, and say, how are you going to get users into that? They say, I don't know, but once we get them, it's going to be great. So that is the hardest problem, is how do you get them in the first place? And the way to do that, what's called bootstrapping a new network, is you've got to focus on what's called the hard side of the network. The hard side is where there's real hard value. Like if you get those people, other people will come. So in eBay's case, you've got to have people selling stuff. There's no point, the first thing you do is attracting buyers, because there's nothing to buy, so they'll very quickly go away. But if you can get some sellers to turn up, even if it's worth going to extraordinary efforts to keep them there, like you pay them to be there, or you give them other in-kind benefits, long enough to attract some buyers, then you can start to relax those benefits over time. And that's called the hard side of the network. What are some of the strategies to do that? Well, let's take Uber, for example. Now, when Uber moves into a new city, its problem is there's no riders and there's no drivers. Now, which side of that is the hard side of the network, do you think? You want to take a guess? Drivers, absolutely, it's the drivers. So that's why Uber, when they start off in the city, especially in the early days, they would just pay drivers to do nothing, as long as you're just on the app waiting. And if you get no calls all day, I'll still give you a day rate, quite attractive day rate. That's why Uber ploughs its way through billions of pounds of investor money, because they were paying lots of drivers all over the world to sit and do nothing long enough for some buyers to turn up, some travellers, some riders, as they call them. And also they gave them really, really generous referral bonuses, and invite a friend to drive, we'll give you lots of money. And what is that? That's a financially incentivised compounding growth mechanism. So they knew all about compounding growth mechanisms. Now once you start to get some buyers, some travellers, some riders, then you start to pull back these generous bonuses, because now you no longer need them, because the drivers are there now because there's a market. But when there's not a market, this is what you've got to do. Let's take another example. In Skyscanner and DoorDash is another example. DoorDash is like one of these things where we'll bring food from a restaurant to a house. So in Skyscanner, we bootstrapped the hard side of the network by just not asking for permission. So in the early days of Skyscanner, we would put airlines onto the website, and within a couple of weeks we'd get a lawyer's letter from Lufthansa, cease and desist it's called. So Gareth, our CEO, had a drawer full of cease and desist letters. Stop doing this, or we're going to take you to court. We don't want our flights on your site. And we kind of ignored those long enough. Didn't always work, with some ropey conversations with Ryanair, because they're completely nuts. But that's another story though, but we would ignore those long enough to build up enough users, and then we go along to Lufthansa, for example, and say, we've got your cease and desist letter, we're happy to take you off the site, but we're now 2% of all your traffic. And they'd be like, well, maybe we don't want to take you off the site just now, but we're not going to pay you any money for bringing these users to us, because we're Lufthansa or we're BA. And then a year later, we say, we're now 10% of all your traffic, and we're going to take you off the site unless you pay us some money. And then that's how the business grew. So there's a lot of other things we did, of course, but that's basically our hard side strategy. We just didn't ask for permission. And that does work. I mean, DoorDash is a much more recent example. They just basically put restaurants onto their site without permission. It didn't really matter to the restaurants, they didn't really know, but people were buying more stuff off them. The fact it was always the same guy coming in off a bicycle and buying it, that didn't matter to them. And then when you've got value for the hard side, you go and say to them, can we have a conversation about you monetising this for us? So, it won't always work, but the point is you've got to have a hard side strategy. Now, here's another approach. Does anyone remember, you obviously know Facebook, does anyone remember Google Plus? Yeah? Now, Google Plus, let's think about the story. We're Google, and we have literally billions of users around the world, and we're going to start Google Plus to kill Facebook. And it didn't work. Initially they had 300 million users within a few weeks, and then it died, and then they quietly was looking to kill the product a couple of years ago. The reason is that they didn't follow the principle of atomic networks. Facebook grew atomic networks. What does that mean? It means they went school by school, university by university, and made sure that although the network was small, it was atomic. There was enough people who knew each other to get value from it. So, for example, people here today, you know each other, you might go into the same product. What Google had done is just say, everybody in our user base, let's put a button to make them Google Plus users. So they ended up with a very large, sparse network where I couldn't find my friends on it, and therefore it wasn't socially very valuable. So Facebook grew small atomic network by atomic network, and they knew what they were doing. It wasn't just chance. We go back to that MySpace conversation, why did Facebook keep growing? They understood their bootstrapping strategy was a series of atomic networks, small but complete networks of people who knew each other, and you just keep adding to those over time. So it's good to see that even the very big companies make big mistakes. Here's another example of that. So do you know Microsoft Teams, I presume? You probably use that here. You know Slack as well. Do you know Slack? People use Slack. Now, Slack is doing really well, and it's still doing all right, but look at the growth of, this is up to 2020, of Teams versus Slack. Microsoft went from way behind, copied Slack in its own style, and then blasted on past it. Now, it did the same trick as Google, you might think, because it uses existing user base, but the point about that is those user bases already knew each other. It was company-based, it's like, everybody here uses Microsoft Outlook and Office and stuff like that, and now we're going to give them Teams. So they did have atomic networks. When I go into Teams in a company, it's all my colleagues, so it worked. It was an atomic network approach. So it just goes through, these things really make a big difference. Understanding these strategies make a huge difference in how things work. And this is also how you can win against a big incumbent. You might say, well, how could I possibly beat Uber if I started a company tomorrow? Because they've got this massive network. But actually what they've got is a network of networks. And you can, if you start a company, you don't have to take them on across there. You just take a bit of the network and attack it. A good example of that is Etsy. If you heard of Etsy, or indeed Airbnb, they attacked Craigslist. The Craigslist is like a massive network of, you can exchange pretty much anything on it. But Etsy came and broke off the bit about arts and crafts, and Airbnb broke off the bit about renting out a spare room, and they attacked bits of the Craigslist network, not the whole thing, just a bit, and grew that into a superior product. So you can always win against these big companies by, even with network effects operating, by taking the most vulnerable part of the network and breaking it off and doing a better job of it. In principle, of course, there's a lot of tactics and luck that goes into that as well. Now, finally on networks, let's talk about anti-network effects. Let's talk about the situation in Twitter just now, for example. Ever wondered why, so Elon Musk just now is laying off lots and lots of people, thousands of people. But do you ever wonder to yourself, why is it, if Twitter existed as a product with a lot of users and only 10 employees, why does it have 7,000 employees? 7,000 is a lot. It's a lot of people. Why does Uber have tens of thousands of employees when originally it was doing pretty well with 100 employees? And the answer is because once a network gets big, unfortunately you start to get anti-network effects. So for example, if Facebook is struggling with anti-network effects because of fake news and other inappropriate material, nowadays if you start a social network, it's all about content moderation. You say, what is a social network? It's a content moderation platform. You have to hire lots and lots of people to moderate content. Uber discovered that there were people driving around in China in taxis with 10 phones in the back, all pretending to be riders. so that the driver could get all those generous discounts I was talking about earlier, all those generous kind of bonuses. So they had to hire a bunch of engineers just to try and detect that usage pattern of IP addresses moving around the city. You know, things you don't think about when you're starting off a network and it's all nice and simple. So these companies end up with so many people, partly because anti-network effects require them to hire people to mitigate those anti-network effects. Things that, if you don't deal with them, will cause the users to start to leave. And the more users that leave, the more users that want to leave. It's the exact mirror image of how you grew. So that every big network is terrified of anti-network effects. And you know, there's various types of this. I mean, to give you, these ones are obvious on the left-hand side, I won't spend time on them. Let's take rebellion, for example. So do you remember Vine? Have you ever heard of Vine? So Vine was a product that was bought by Twitter for about 30 million, which isn't a lot nowadays. It was a kind of like TikTok before there was TikTok. Short videos you could watch. Now they suffered a hard side rebellion. It's called, sounds like the name of a Disney Star Wars spin-off. Hopefully it would be a bit better quality, but they had a hard side rebellion because in Vine, something like 100 Vine content producers were responsible for literally billions of impressions. They were the most active, they were the hard side, you want to keep them. And they realised they were the hard side, and they went to Twitter and said, if you pay us $1.2 million each, we'll publish 12 Vines a month each. And Twitter said, no thanks, so they all left, so Vine died. Hard side rebellion. That was quite an extreme case. Uber regularly has its most active drivers in San Francisco, they earn most of the money, campaigning outside the office for better conditions. That's a hard side rebellion. They've got to manage it because it could be quite catastrophic for them because the people who earn the most money are rebelling. So there's lots of ways anti-network effects hit, and it often leads to a whole bunch of employees having to be hired to manage those kind of things. So think about Twitter, for example. Putting aside all the drama, what's happening in Twitter just now? Well, partly it's never been profitable. So it's never found a business model that monetizes properly. So that's a hard problem to solve, and it needs action. And the previous management hasn't actioned it. And partly Elon Musk has decided that, okay, they hired a lot of people because of anti-network effects, but they hired too many. And none of us know if that's true. And I remember being in Twitter in San Francisco one afternoon, several years ago, like 6 or 7 years ago, and it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There were hundreds of employees in the main kind of atrium area watching the World Cup on TV. I remember thinking, this company is overhired. These people aren't busy. You know, it just didn't have the feel of a company that really knew why it had its employees. So I think it's probably true that they have massively overhired. Now, Elon Musk is going in a very extreme way to address that. And again, applying what we've learned in this lecture, perhaps he's forgetting about anti-network effects. You know, because now we're hearing there's a rise in inappropriate content, and that will drive users away. Donald Trump's back on the platform. I know 2 friends who've just deleted their accounts. You know, so how this is going to work out is interesting. But these are the tools we should use to analyse it, not the drama of, oh, did you see that tweet from that ex-engineer? It's what happened with network effects versus anti-network effects. How is that playing out? Because it's basically just a big network. That's why it's powerful. So finally, just to finish off, what about the foundations of all this? How do you establish the foundations to get these mechanisms running? So let's look at that. Now, in a lot of businesses, this is how people used to think about things. You know, I'm in marketing and I don't work in any other function, and my job is to acquire users. But people in engineering would say, well, our job is just to build features. We don't care about marketing or the user, we build features. And that didn't work very well because the actual way you attract users cuts across all of those boundaries. So for example, we bring them to the website or app, acquire them, we activate them into a habit around the product. Whenever I want to search for a flight or use Skyscanner, when I buy a Christmas present, I'll go into Amazon. These are habits. We have to activate people into habits, retain them in those habits, and when we do that, so let's just move out here, we can monetize them. Because we can't monetize them when we're still using the product, and we can encourage them to refer new users. So this cuts across a whole bunch of skills in a business and has implications for how you organise for a business. But the most important of these states is the retention state. because only then can I monetize and cause new users to be referred. But how important is that? So let's skip to that, sorry. How important is that state? Well, do you remember this Farmville example? The reason that happened is because they didn't retain the users. They signed them up, and they were telling their friends about the product, saying, yeah, screw, you should try Farmville. Farmville was like one of the first games on Facebook. You should try Farmville, but they weren't being retained. So it didn't matter if you'd read all the previous slides and implemented all that stuff. You weren't keeping the users. Here's another example. This is Vidi. Now, Vidi's another pre-TikTok type thing. In 2012, it was doing super well, shooting away up in terms of interest in users, and so much so that at the height of that graph, they had 30 million users, and they just got another $30 million of investment from credible investors. And there's even Snoop Dogg who decided to endorse the product, so you're getting somewhere if Snoop Dogg's endorsing your product. And then this happened, despite these investors being super savvy. And what happened there is that signing up users is not the same as having them active. And they were so busy focusing on having, we've got 1 million downloads this month, but are those people still using the product? That's the issue. So let's look at the theory of that for a second. On the left-hand side here, I've got active users, and we've got time periods for weeks or months along the right. Now, active users are important. Downloads, number of people who've signed up is irrelevant. These are what's called vanity metrics. They make you feel good, but the only thing that matters is people who are still actively involved in your product. And even in a market where nobody leaves your product, eventually your graph does this because the market's finite. It's why most economic theory has a problem, because growth can't go on forever. And it's also true for your product. You can't grow infinitely in a finite market. So even in the best case, you run out of users, and that's why companies like Google always invent new products, and Facebook's trying to create the metaverse, because they're full, the world is full of Facebook, because it does this. But now let's imagine I had a little bit of noise. So this is what it looks like inside, I should say. In each time period, there's a different colour here. We get 1,000 users in the first time period. They always stay because no one leaves. We get a wee bit less the second time period because the market is not quite as accessible as it was. The really easy sign-ups have happened. And as we go on, the number of users we sign up in each time period just gets thinner and thinner. There's less and less available. It gets harder and harder. But if I add a little bit of noise in here, let's say that every month, 1% of my users leaves the product. It doesn't sound like much, but already we get to a much lower peak and we're starting to decline just with 1% loss. And what's happening inside, if we x-ray that graph, we can see every one of the cohorts of users we signed up a given month are starting to decline. And if you increase that churn a little bit, you start to get these graphs. So with 5% churn, it's already bad. If 25% of your users churn every month, then it's a yellow line, it's catastrophic. And that's what it looks like. If you look at each one of these cohorts, they're immediately diminishing and hemorrhaging users. So it looks a bit like the Farmville case. That's how you get jumping the shark. Because in every month you're losing users and your retention's not working. People don't like your product. I try it. I'm not still using it. But so many businesses, because they're so focused on, we've had more downloads than ever, the referrals are working really well, they're not looking at this kind of data at all. They don't know what they're active users. They don't even know what it means to say I've got an active user. They just don't know. So the key point here is retention dominates eventually. It always does. When I go into a company, the first thing I say is, show me your user retention chart. And you say, what user retention chart? And say, talk to me next week when you've got one. So, what influences retention? Well, things like how engaged are users. So, how do I increase engagement intensity? Because retention is a function of how engaged people are. So, for example, if product A has this level of engagement, once a month I use it, but product B is once a week, product B is going to retain its users longer. So you've got to drive engagement if you want to drive retention. For example, if I start a product called myfuneral.com, then what's the problem with that? Well, everybody's going to die, so it's got high market reach, but I'm only going to use it once. So it's not a great product. That might sound a bit silly, but what about dating apps? Now, dating apps are interesting. If I meet somebody and settle down with them on the dating app, you would hope I'd stop using the product. Not always the case, perhaps, with Tinder, But you know, that's normally the pattern. If I don't find someone in one of these products, I'm also going to stop using it. So they're not, you know, great things to invest in, you know, as an investor, because they have almost have bad retention designed into them. So when I'm picking a product to build, I want to be thinking about that right now. What are the retention and engagement characteristics? So these things have got really high engagement for a short time, and you know, that's not the best type of product. So if you look at, you can put all of our products into a kind of frequency chart and say, like, it's much easier to be Google and Facebook than it is to be Skyscanner or Booking.com, because we couldn't force people to travel more often than they wanted to. You know, couldn't get a family of 4 to take 4 holidays a year. It would take 1 a year. So we had, you know, we always in travel, growing it to get an exponential growth is really difficult because it's very hard to drive frequency. Let's look at what Amazon's done about that. Amazon started off as a monthly product, you know, buy books and, you know, that sort of stuff. But then they moved to be a buy anything product, so that meant I might use it weekly. Did that on purpose. Then they moved to streaming video and streaming music. Why is that? Because people listen to music every day. They're trying to drive their engagement, and driving engagement in any one of the products drives it to some extent in all of them. And they also use ways of bringing you back. The bottom line here is, how do we increase your usage of the features that we do have? And we do things like, you know, mail you these emails, you know, you've just bought some power tools. We recommend some power tools. They're not very good at it, because they always recommend the thing you just bought, but that's what they're trying to do. So, you know, Prime is a great example of this, you know, the bundling that they do there. Or here's an example from Netflix. See this next episode playing in 10 seconds stuff? That's to increase your engagement. It's the one, you know, I'm just watching the next episode, you know, and if I'm watching the next episode, I might start to think of other episodes to watch and so on and so forth. Or here's a really subtle thing they do. Netflix user 1 and 2, The Godfather, same movie, different picture. So they're using massive AI engines to say, well, based on what you previously watched, I think you prefer a romantic view of The Godfather, or, you know, maybe you're a sad person who looks into the distance a lot, so maybe you prefer the top one. It depends on the films you've watched to drive engagement. So they've got this down to, you know, real science, which, you know, here's another one you've got to have watched. Has anyone watched Riverdale? Would anyone admit to that? I promise I haven't, but here we are, same thing again. Is it a romance? Or is it a, you know, mysterious thriller? It's the same program, but based on what you like to watch will change how it looks. And finally, to go back to this TikTok versus YouTube, why is TikTok growing more quickly in the structural sense than YouTube? It isn't because, you know, one team is much better than the other, because you can all afford to hire the very best people out there and salaries they can pay them. It's because TikTok videos are shorter. So because they're shorter, I get more data about what you like watching more quickly than YouTube does, by a factor of at least 10. And therefore I can tune things faster and I can grow faster. So now we see, of course, YouTube trying to do the same thing. But it's quite interesting how these things play out. So I hope that was a useful tour. Again, my meta point is entrepreneurship and innovation is about mindset, but it's also about technique. And you want to be studying the technique, and the techniques to study are, well, where do you find them? Switch on your brain to what's happening around you. Look at what's happening at Twitter and say, you know, if I was to parse this from a technique perspective, what might it reveal? You know, pretend you're the CEO of these companies, and that's how you'll learn to become the CEO of those companies. So, thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.